Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment ending in number 19 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brooks of Alabama, page 45, strike line 6 and all that follows through page 47, line 3.
Pursuant to House Resolution 287, the gentleman from Alabama and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Chairman, America recently suffered 4 straight trillion-dollar deficits. In the past few months, America's debt blew through the $18 million mark. America pays over $200 billion per year in debt service, which is more than 4 times what the federal government spends on highways, bridges, and interstates each year. America's Comptroller General warns that America's deficits and debt paths are unsustainable. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office warns that our debt service cost is on a path to increase by another $600 billion within a decade to more than $800 billion per year. That's more than America spends each year on national defense. The CBO also warns that within a decade, if current trends continue, America will face yearly trillion-dollar deficits in perpetuity. Per then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen's testimony before the House Armed Services Committee, debt is America's, quote, greatest threat to our national security, end quote. As a result of America's debt, in a few short years, America's uniformed military personnel numbers will be our smallest since before World War II. America's Navy will have the smallest number of operational naval vessels since World War I, and America's Air Force will have its smallest number of operational aircraft in its history. Debt, not our enemies, is slowly but surely stripping America of its ability to defend itself. In sum, Washington's financial irresponsibility, this House of Representatives' financial irresponsibility, is pushing America into a debilitating insolvency and bankruptcy that will destroy the American dream for our children and grandchildren. It is in this setting that I beseech this House of Representatives to be financially responsible by supporting my amendment that eliminates federal government operating subsidies of Amtrak, thus forcing Amtrak to operate in the black. How bad is the Amtrak subsidy problem? The Congressional Research Service reports that from 1971 to 2015, federal Amtrak subsidies totaled $78 billion in constant 2015 dollars. In fiscal year 2014, Amtrak had a net loss of $1.1 billion. Who paid for that loss? America's children and grandchildren. That's who. How so? Because America does not have the money and had to borrow every penny of that $1.1 billion, thus burdening Americans for generations to come. Mr. Chairman, a business that relies on subsidies and tax dollars to cover losses has little incentive to operate efficiently or effectively, or for that matter, as safely as it should. It is appalling that the federal government undermines and threatens the future of America's children and grandchildren in order to subsidize Amtrak passenger service that would be self-sufficient if Amtrak riders stopped mooching off of hardworking American taxpayers and instead simply paid for the actual cost of their rides. Amtrak supporters often claim that Amtrak will go out of business if it's not subsidized by American taxpayers. That's bunk unsupported by facts. The same woe is me argument was made about freight train subsidies, yet when freight rail subsidies ended and freight rail was sold to private investors in the 1980s, freight rail did not go out of business and still operates today. Similarly, the federal government does not operate or subsidize national airlines or national bus services, yet airlines and buses operate profitably in the private sector, despite federal government subsidies for Amtrak, their competitor. Just as airlines, bus services, and freight rail operate without government subsidies, Amtrak will do the same if this House of Representatives has the courage to wean Amtrak from the taxpayer nipple. Mr. Chairman, after more than 40 years, it's time to stop the runaway Amtrak train. It's time to force Amtrak riders to pay their own way by ending their subsidized rides on the backs of American taxpayers. I urge adoption of my amendment. To do just that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would respond that there is no factual basis for the gentlelady's comments that have just been made. Socialism does not work. We need to get Amtrak passengers off the backs of all taxpayers, including those that are poor, that can't afford the taxes that they're already having to pay to benefit those Amtrak riders. Let's set them free.
The amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment ending in number 21 at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brooks of Alabama, page 47, strike line 4, and all that follows through page 49, line 8.
Pursuant to House Resolution 287, the gentleman from Alabama and the member proposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My previous amendment, Brooks 19, my first amendment, strikes $288.5 million in operating subsidies for Amtrak. This second amendment, which is Brooks number 21, strikes capital and debt service subsidies that total $850 million per year to get to the point where we can strike all of taxpayer subsidies for Amtrak. I would rely on the arguments previously made with respect to my first amendment to support this second amendment. I would add, however, that I've heard some comments about the safety associated with Amtrak. I would emphasize at this point that if you want safety with rail service, probably the best thing to do is to put it in the private sector and eliminate Amtrak altogether. Look at airlines, air carriers. They're private sector, much safer than Amtrak. Look at buses. Private sector, safer than Amtrak, and I would submit that if lives are what concerns the opponents to these amendments, that they would propose putting Amtrak into private hands in order to have the same kind of safety record that we have with buses, air carriers, and other modes of private transportation. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Alabama is now recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would submit that the argument that this would end rail service is absolutely false and is not supported by history. Nothing in history supports the gentleman's argument, however well-intentioned. The evidence is clear. Freight rail, same kind of argument made. Subsidies were ended. It went into the private sector. It survives and thrives today. There is the argument that buses and air carriers are somehow or another subsidized. I would submit that what we're talking about there are user fees, and that there are gasoline taxes and diesel taxes that pay for those roads that buses use, and there are air passenger charges that pay for the cost of those airports that air carriers use. So with that as a backdrop, I would submit that it's time for Amtrak passengers to pay their own way. It is time for Amtrak passengers to quit riding on the backs of other taxpayers. They have the ability to pay their own way. The rest of the country is expected to pay their own way when they travel, and as such, I would ask this body to adopt my amendment. I yield back the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Amendment. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Ask for recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama will be postponed.